So we're going to look at a pair of themes over the next couple of classes. But the first one is disempowerment, and then obviously connected to this is the ways in which empowerment or liberation or fulfillment is seen in the novel itself. But the problems of individuals in feeling a sense of fulfillment and empowerment in the text are manifold and wide-ranging, and RIVIERE itself. So, in the novel, the fact that individuals don't know that they share the same experience with one another is inhibited by a wide range of different things. The main one is a long-standing legacy of social hierarchy, which is determined by race and racial types. And then the socioeconomic power dynamics that underpin that hierarchy. So people are prevented from understanding their interconnections and their consistent sense of relationship with each other because of these social factors, which are in many ways the legacy of colonial history. Even though many of the characters understand that it belongs to the past, colonial history frames the way that individuals understand their community in this text. For example, the lightness or darkness of skin, or the ability to command a workforce in the fields, for example, for Lululemon, are indicators of status in this profoundly hierarchical society. As a result of this, the fact that people can't understand this sense of commonality and shared experience, loneliness, isolation, and resentment are the kind of the default experiences in the community. But those experiences are shared universally amongst those characters, which establishes connections with the world outside the novel, but also between the characters within it. So there's this sort of unconscious sense of commonality that the novel creates, that sense of, you know, the root network under the surface of the water of the mangrove that you can't see if you look above it. You only see the individual shoots of trees, the individual characters. Alienation in the text is an example of this universally shared experience. And almost every character in the novel, and say almost every character in the novel, experiences a form of alienation, either from others in the community or from a clear understanding of how to overcome his or her problems. You know, there's an alienation of understanding in this text that completely precludes and prevents the characters from formulating solutions to their states of disempowerment and lack of fulfillment. Francis Sancho is an interesting, fascinating one. He is attempting to trace bloodlines of his ancestry to reach a clear understanding of this personal history. But that leads to an impasse, a kind of stasis, a point of blockage or a lack of progression, of incomprehensibility. The bloodlines don't make sense to him. He finds himself, unable to make sense of his shared Creole identity. When he traces his family history, Sancho comes to RIVIERE to discover this truth about his past. But searching for his family's home is fruitless. And despite all this searching along the traces in the forests, there were no traces left anywhere of this kind of formidable mansion. And so he can't find any kind of geographical evidence of the past. And his bloodlines, like most of the Caribbean, are not linear or easily traceable. So this, we think of the metaphor of the tree as being hierarchical and linear, and it doesn't make sense for Sancho. His name is also Francisco Alvarez Sanchez, and so you can see even just the way he names himself shows us this mixed ethnic and cultural heritage. Also, his ancestors who lived in RIVIERE were both murderous slave owners and slaves alike, and so that irreconcilable sense of contradiction at the core of who he is makes this sort of impasse of incomprehensibility, the fact that he's both historically murderer and innocent murdered, means that he struggles to make sense of who he is by referring to the past. So this difficult history, physical traces of which have disappeared, becomes inaccessible to Sancho. He can't get access to this history. He then becomes paralyzed by an obsession with a past that he can't forget, and a curse that he feels is on his family that he's unable to understand. And because of this, he's unable to author his autobiography because he's focused on self-destruction and not creation. He seems obsessed with a kind of a destructive impulse. And so he is completely disempowered in the text, unable to navigate a way out of this for himself. And you see that in that central articulation of the mangrove symbol in the story. The impossibility of his testimony is summarized in Vilma's response to his idea of calling this text Crossing the Mangrove. She says, "You don't cross a mangrove, you'd spike yourself on the roots of the mangrove trees. You'd be sucked down and suffocated by the brackish mud." So he is trapped in this impasse, this impossible attempt to make sense of himself. And it's dangerous for him, the past. Its truth is often hidden beneath this kind of obscurity, which we can think of in the kind of mangrove metaphor as the kind of murky waters of interpretation. So his attempt to discover the truth by going in search of hidden realities, you can be pulled down into the mire of history by doing so. He can be pulled down and suffocated by the brackish mud, which is literally what happens to him. Found face down in that mud. By looking to the past for truth and answers, you can remain locked in place, bound to it and unable to move forward. And that's precisely what Condé warns us against. He doesn't want people to make sense of themselves in this way. It's impossible then for Sancho to trace past events because they're multiplied through individual perspectives. There is no absolute truth about the past, and he only encounters this multiple sense of contradictory truth. So there is no original source for a lot of these truths. And it's impossible to trace these roots when looking upon a mangrove because all of these confusing connections are submerged beneath the murky waters. So there's this sense of it's not worth delving into the root network. You just want to cross it and move in a different direction. So although there might appear to be a crossing between trees that would provide a viable route through a mangrove, we don't know whether there's obstructions along this route hidden beneath the water. So instead of mapping his history and making it comprehensible, Sancho tries to destroy it. And that's what he does with Vilma. He destroys the text that he's writing. And then he also attempts to destroy his own future bloodline, which we see when he tries to perform an abortion on MIRA to prevent the birth of their child. So he's engaged in this sense of destruction, shows that he is unable to use the past productively to make sense of his identity, and falls into the trap of the mangrove. Now, DODOSE, ROSA, DINAH, and MIRA all share something in terms of disempowerment. And they all share experiences of sacrifice that often involve loneliness and despair and acute unhappiness in love. Again, that shared interconnection is contrasted with the fact that they don't communicate this sense of universal experience with one another. So these implicit shared experiences of loneliness and feelings of suffocation are like the kind of submerged roots of the rhizome. And they're the links among the characters. So all of these interconnected elements of sharing are symbolically correlated with the roots of the rhizomatic mangrove. And each of these women faces a kind of impasse, a point of stasis and of stagnation. Whether it's the sacrifice of identity or youth, or along a path of marriage and children, every woman's story is at the same time both singular and shared. The ways in which they face this impasse are varied, heterogeneous, as we keep saying, but that impasse is universal to each of these characters. They all go through this. MIRA, for example, will never share Sancho's life in marriage, and because of this, she encounters an impasse because she can't build an identity in relation to him. She gets kind of trapped in a moment of stagnation because she can't rely on him to build an identity that is contingent upon him, you know, as a wife or a partner. She also faces this impasse of incomprehension, of misunderstanding, because Sancho refuses to tell her the truth. After he drugs her and attempts an abortion of their child, she learns the pain of an irrevocable betrayal of trust, so she is unable to move forward because of this. And MIRA can no longer follow the paths through the forest that she describes that she once trusted, nor is she able to escape into idle daydreams about strangers who rescue her from her life. Even the ravine that she treats as sacred is lost, and she can no longer trust that place where she sought the comfort of her lost mother. So each of these characters build their identity, in relation to an ideal other, which is usually Sancho. And in RIVIERE, many individuals have built an ideal image of Sancho and tried to make that identity in relation to him. But the desire to do this is met, particularly with MIRA and DINAH, with a sense of disillusionment and frustration. But their shared alienation is a reason why not all of the characters who feel disappointment because of Sancho are women. Other characters experience this sense of alienation in response to him. Moise being one of them. He's one of these characters that feels this. Through the novel, Moise goes too far in his desire to learn more about his friend, and this kind of curiosity gets the best of him when he is caught invading Sancho's privacy by looking through his possessions. He discovers him with money in his hand and mistakes his kind of curiosity about Sancho for just petty thievery. He's then brutally rejected by Sancho, who he considers his only friend, and is thrown out on the street. So in this way, both of them, Moise and MIRA, unwittingly share this experience, this sense of rejection by Sancho, who they admire, and someone who they see as a kind of deliverance from their painful existence in RIVIERE. But there's a deeper cause for that disappointment, because both of them project an ideal, sort of desired image onto Sancho, building him up into something that he fails to be. They're looking for too much from him. Aristide is interesting in this sense because he idealizes the forest, which is teeming with life. And this idealization of the forest is a kind of almost Edenic idyll before time, where human influence couldn't kind of taint or deflower the landscape. It's not until he's actually freed from this incestuous and unnatural love that he has for MIRA that he actually is capable of looking broadly to the future and envisioning a wide horizon. When he's contemplating the trees of this mountain forest, Aristide is confronted with this vision. It says suddenly his life had unfolded in front of his eyes, flat and featureless like the island of Marie Galante. He imagines leaving RIVIERE, and he says, yes, he would leave the island without a future where, apart from the size of his penis, nothing tells the man he's a man. Flowers have no motherland. They'll perfume any land. This quote is an important realization because it evokes this decentered, deterritorialized reality of nature, and also of the kind of rhizomatic structure of the mangrove itself. And he realizes that he can flourish anywhere. He realizes he can engage in this business that he works in with his father in Guadeloupe, all over the place. But even though he's decided to leave the island, he's still in the mire. He's still trapped in this kind of swamp of a patriarchal, essentializing discourse, where he sees MIRA, someone who he'd conceived the treasure of his heart, as dirtied and soiled by the rejection of another man. He also sees Guadeloupe through this kind of primitive, essentializing, patriarchal discourse. He sees the landscape as being deflowered, as opposed to this kind of bounteous, virginal forest before time. And so his future only seems to promise continued kind of capturing and imprisoning of the natural world and a recreation of his father's nurseries. So even though he opens his mind up to the possibility of a broader horizon, his methods of thinking bear the stains and the hallmarks of that crude hierarchy and that crude, painful way of thinking that colonialism had imparted on these people. Lulu and Sylvestre, again, interesting, in that they're both wealthy planters and enforce patriarchal rule in their private lives, in their economic activities, and in their social interactions. And Lulu idealizes the era of slavery in which there was absolute freedom for the strong, as he describes it. And he feels as if he should have been born when his ancestor, DODOSE, was able to murder slaves without worrying about it, without caring about the consequences, with impunity. And now he decries what he calls the era of social security, because he could go to prison for employing illegal Haitian immigrants. But whilst he can't wield this sort of power, Sylvestre can prove dominance by material wealth. He speaks of Vilma, his daughter, in terms of money, and her worth is measured by the financial power she would command if she married the man he chose for her. So they are both trapped in these very hierarchical ways of thinking. So even though his genuine efforts in the pépinière have been met with hostility by his mother and extended family, Lulu doesn't see the irony in his reproach for the black labourers he employs. He's blinded to this irony by a wholesale acceptance of a discourse of racial hierarchy. He cannot see that the irony in his hostility towards these people that he hires, because he is so deeply enmeshed in the sense of supremacy that he has on the basis of that crude hierarchical system. Sylvestre, on the other hand, his childhood has a kind of problematic impact on him. He's victimized at a young age by his father. When he was 10, he was accompanying his father to the temple, where he witnessed a sacrifice of a goat, which was so shocking to him that he screamed and basically wet himself, staining his white suit. He was labelled from that moment on the boy who had shamed his papa by his family. So even though he later adopted a Hindu identity to kind of atone for this shameful event, his father never forgives him. So he attempts to compensate for this shame by just amassing money, more money than he could dream of, as he says in the text. And he idealizes his father's era, where financial wealth kind of translated directly in the power to command others. As he says when he says, Sylvestre recalls how he used to hand out the pay to the workers. He remembered how he snapped his whip over the head of the oxen as he drove the cart.